I wanted to talk a bit about why poetry is important. Yeah. Now, I think the majority of people, maybe not the majority, but a good number of people would probably say that there's nothing wrong with poetry, but they're not exactly interested in it themselves. That it might be an old form of entertainment, perhaps, but not entirely very happening or purposeful now. It's something that high school teachers make you read and write stuff about, and you gotta like learn metaphor and like meter and stuff, like that it has no purpose outside of a stupid test or something. That really isn't entirely true, and I'll talk a bit about like what my belief of the purpose of poetry is, but I'll also put a number of links down there, or if it's in the future, wherever YouTube decides to move the comment bar. Yeah. Sort of about what exactly is going on in poetry now and what I think the purpose of it is, well, not what but like the internet world, scholars and such, I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, first off, some people probably don't understand exactly how connected they are to poetry to begin with. When we're very young, one of the ways that we learn to communicate and learn to grasp and understand language itself is by learning how to rhyme. And you've probably heard babies do this all the time. They're like, they can only say like one word. Like, I was with an older friend of mine this weekend, and she has a baby, and the baby could only say hi. And kind of like dada, but it would say like repeated like da 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 da. It is crazy. But lost my train of thought. But the child can make a lot of weird noise, almost like gibberish. It sounds like a language, but it's not like real words. It's like I can't even like pretend to like imitate it, but everyone's heard it. And a lot of times it's a repeated sound or sounds or just similar ways of expressing a sound over and over again. That scientifically is like rhyme itself is one of the ways that young children and infants learn how to process like motor control of their mouth. And the reason I mention it all is because a great number of poems do rhyme. Not all have to. But that sort of almost musical, rhythmic repetition that's in poetry is how most human beings are entered into the English language, or well, any language really, entered into the process of learning a language to begin with. When a child does know how to speak and can understand more thoroughly, parents or teachers or daycare people or whatever, they start like reading like nursery rhymes and stuff, you know, like Jack be nimble or whatever. Like Jack be nimble, Jack be quick, Jack jump over the candlestick or whatever. That in itself is poetry. It's like, it doesn't have the same gravity though. It's like, that is poetry. No. But again, it's another way of children learning how to process language, but also the information that's within it. I mean, most of those old limericks or little ditty things are fairly depressing in my mind, but they have like children's books and things like that, and children's songs. They have moral implications, or even just educational implications, like clean up, everybody clean up. Like, that's so dumb, but they stick because poetry and rhyming and just that whole concept in language sticks in the human brain. And then we grow up, and teachers start giving us, like, write a haiku, which haiku doesn't actually translate correctly in English language, and the fact that the English language would adopt haiku the way that it does is fairly depressing. But anyway, that sort of concept of archaic poetry being taught, most people find that they lose their interest. For some people, they might grow into a passion of it, or they might unknowingly grow into a passion of lyricism, like they like to write lyrics to songs, but think itself that poetry doesn't have too much of a purpose. And that is where I wish to step in. Okay. Speaking of lyrics, a modern implication that's very common is the poetry in lyrics. That's not subject to any genre. Some sort of genres of rap actually sell themselves more as being like rhythmic or music. Poetry puts in music. Others don't. But the very root of it, of all of that, is that before you really consider it as a whole song, the lyrics itself have the same, I don't want to say structure, but they come from the same root as poetry. And so every song, which music is so important in our culture, in the modern culture so much, everyone, well, not everyone, but most people have like several hundred songs on their music devices or whatever in their phones. They're listening to it, at least, in like commercials on TV or just on the radio for their own fun. They're exposed to a poetic language day in and day out. But that isn't to say that, let me see if I can get this out. That isn't to say that that is the only form of poetry that is existent now. It's merely one form that impacts a lot of people that some don't even recognize as poetry itself, which it is. There is an insect, and it is scary. Maybe not scary, that's okay. Caught me off guard. Gotta get my thought back. Anyway, the reason people are so interested in writing lyrics or just to having that kind of concept of themselves is fairly personal, and depends on the person. Many people find like rhythmic poetry itself interesting because they like the feeling of, I suppose, moving through the musical and rhythmic aspect of the way language can work. Like that. Yeah. That's pretty much what I had to say on that. But also, everyone's got like one or two of those songs that are like, oh, I just love it so much, it's like my life, and it's because something in the sound, in the words, in what the person has said connects with them specifically connects with them. And I would venture to say that that was probably most of the intention throughout the thousands of years that poetry has been in societies, that was the thing that drew people to it. It's true that in the past people were more interested in buying books of poetry than they are now. They also didn't have CDs. Not that they didn't listen to music or that they didn't have lyricists, but a book of poetry was more marketable maybe 70 years ago than a record or whatever. And even further back than that, when they didn't have like recordable music, songbooks, hymn books, just poetry in general. I mean, it was easily marketable, and people bought it because it fulfilled that same desire to be able to connect to something that someone has said. Now, that brings up the question, what is the difference between poetry and prose? There is prose poetry, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But I was thinking about it earlier. A book, if you have a book, even if it's really great, it takes a good deal of time to get through it, usually. It takes a good deal of energy, and even though it's worthwhile, it's not as instantaneous as like a poem. Sorry, the camera's shaking so much. But it's the same as a movie. Everyone wants to watch movies. Well, not everyone wants to watch movies, but most people would like to watch a movie, and they have their favorite movies for whatever reason they like it. But it is not as instantaneous or at the moment impactful as something like a music video. Because with poetry, you're condensing that emotion and that drive and that concept into a single point. I mean, some poems are several pages long, but, you know, that's generally shorter than, like, a 500-page novel, usually. It's so much more than the story itself. It's like a photograph of the individual who is writing that to begin with and their meaning. In the same way that you could watch a documentary on a historical event, it's not the same thing as seeing a specific photograph, like one photograph of the height of that moment, which transferably that would be like poetry is to whatever the situation is. You could write a book about how, well, let's take something dramatic. You could write a book about a woman's experience, or anyone really. It's not an individual's experience with an eating disorder, but the process of seeing that throughout the book and the plot is what's impactful. To write a poem about that would be to gather the emotion in that moment, in whatever the height of that moment is that the individual wanted to give. It would have so much more of an instantaneous impact on the reader than reliving the story and the facts in a 300-page novel about that same concept. Yeah. In that way, personally, I think poetry is quite addictive. To experience something so quickly, to have a story so quickly, and just being able to look over it over and over again in the matter of a few minutes without having to expend the same amount of energy in a giant novel, though I do like reading giant novels, don't get me wrong. That sort of instantaneous connection is very appealing, and I believe if more people had an understanding of what that instantaneous connection was, or an appreciation in themselves, because I believe most people aren't exposed to real good poetry. They're just given a couple things that they're told that are literary masterpieces in school, and then that's that, and they never want to look at another one because they think it's crap, because it doesn't connect with them personally. Then they never want to look at it. But if they're exposed to more, if they're given the understanding that there's something else out there, that there was an author, there was a poet somewhere who connected to their situation and wrote something that they would instantaneously connect with, that they would have an interest in it. Now, in that same concept, poetry in itself can be incredibly therapeutic, both in the writing process and reading it. As strange as it might sound, I mean, you look at a lot of the more famous poets, the more famous lyricists, and they have a reputation of not being the most giddy individuals in the world. They're probably, there's some ideas on what that kind of not personality, but more like that kind of state of mind might bring to an individual. For poetry, like why there are so many messed up poets, but really if you think about it, there really are a lot of messed up scientists, a lot of messed up artists, so anyway, gosh, I'll start from the beginning. Poetry is therapeutic. Individuals who were, for whatever reason, at the end of their rope, found themselves fairly prolific in their writing, and I believe very much so that it was because they were finding some sort of relief or instantaneous, I keep saying that word, I'm sorry, momentary positive energy from the process of writing a poem, of getting their thoughts on paper, and then in return reading their own work and reading other people's work. Yeah. Let's see, where else do I want to go with this? Back in the day, there were like household names of poets, even ones that you know, like you still hear now, the ones that you still read in textbooks in school and stuff. People would actually, I mean, it was like common for people to actually read these poets. I mean, I guess there would be a little bit of literary elitism connected with that, but especially after the 50s, well, even a little bit earlier than that in some occasions, the elitism was counteracted by like anti-elitism. If you think of Jack Kerouac, he wrote a number of novels, but he also was a fairly prolific poet, a very bizarre poet in his time, and people were reading his stuff because his name was it was fairly famous. I mean, I don't want to say like a poet rock star, but that is probably the best interpretation that I can give. People knew what kind of scene they might be looking at if they were going to go and look into the poetry scene, like what big names there are. Today, I'm not even sure what a lot of the big names are in the very elite, very literary-oriented poetry scene. I do know a few. I do know a little bit about who's going where and doing what, but it is not like the way it was. People used to anticipate people's work, and I don't want to like overly generalize here, but a great deal of the novels that are sold now are paperback novels in grocery stores, in general stores and things like that. Like they have that section, and for the most part I've rarely ever seen anything related to poetry in there. Those are the top bestsellers. People aren't buying poetry chapbooks to the extent of them being bestsellers. Not like Stephen King, not like just Mary Higgins Clark. I don't know. Those are the big names that you always see. They've always gotten something new out. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people actually working some sort of scene. A good scene, or, well, a good scene, I guess, I don't know, the forefront of the poetry scene, I believe, it's working now, isn't on paper. It's the slam poetry scene. I don't, maybe I'll do a video later at a different time on what exactly slam poetry is, but I'll leave some links to some people's poems. A good number of you probably already have a basic understanding of what it is, even if it is sort of tainted with kind of this misconception of it being people screaming on a stage. It's a bit more than that, a bit more diverse. That, right now, that the work that's being done in that scene, I believe, touches the most people and runs the most quickly, and is the most, I guess, supposedly marketable in our current culture and environment than a number of the great masters, or the to-be masters right now. Again, I'm not going to explain a great deal on why that is. Maybe in another video. But that is to say that there is a flourishing, birthing, what is this? I don't know. There is a flourishing state in poetry right now. Oh, sorry. There is a demand for it. A great demand, a huge demand. One that is easily accessible, that a lot of people are connected with, and a lot of people go into, even in their cities. I personally have been to several open mics. I've never been to one of the big slams, even though I live next to a huge city, which is actually, like, the larger cities generally actually have national slams, ones with actual teams. I've yet to go there, but that's for other reasons. Anyway. Yeah. I seem to ramble myself in a corner, and I can't really figure out how to end this video. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, that there is an importance to poetry. In the more literary sense, almost prayer-like, meditative place, like, I think it might be the Japanese symbol, I'm not sure, but it's either Japanese or Chinese symbol for poetry is word temple, and that's something to chew on, something that for thousands of years the craft of poetry has had sort of an ethereal, almost spiritual process, like the art of it was important to people, and it still is, even though a great number of people have forgotten or completely ignored the prospect of what that is. I can't personally make anyone like poetry. I wouldn't want to do that. I would say that not everyone is, I guess not everyone is born to be the next T.S. Eliot, but that the practice of poetry for many people is incredibly important, just for the mere fact of expressing themselves in a format that's not as structured as, this is my day, this is my diary, hello, goodbye, kind of, well, I don't even know what that was, but, you know. That, yeah, leave it at that. Check out the links. And thanks for watching.